From the Daily Catch, this is The Catch Up, and I'm Walter Mullin. In today's episode, we're discussing a leadership transition at Bard College, one that comes with complicated questions about judgment, transparency, and accountability. Following the release last week of an independent investigation into his past relationship with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, longtime Bard president Leon Botstein announced that he will step down this June. The report found no criminal wrongdoing, but it did conclude that Botstein was not fully accurate in how he described the extent of that relationship, which included years of contact and financial ties linked to Epstein's role as a donor. The findings have raised serious concerns, not just about one individual, but about the broader culture of fundraising and oversight in higher education. So what does this moment mean for Bard, for Botstein's legacy, and for the standards we expect from institutional leaders? That's what we're unpacking today. I'm joined by Daily Catch Editor-in-Chief Emily Sachar, who will bring us up to date on this story and where it might be headed. It's the week of May 4th. Emily, it's nice to be back in the studio with you again.
Ditto, Walter. So great to be together.
So, Emily, for listeners who haven't followed this news, tell us what happened last week.
Yes. So Leon Botstein announced that he will retire as president of Bard College on June 30th, after almost 51 years leading the institution. The announcement, Walter, came one day after Bard's Board of Trustees received WilmerHale's review of Botstein's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. WilmerHale is a prominent Washington, D.C. law firm. And that review found that Botstein did nothing illegal, as you said, but that he exercised poor judgment that raised serious questions about his leadership. What is striking here, Walter, is that until very recently, Botstein had repeatedly indicated in meetings with faculty, staff, and students, and including with some interviews with the media, that he intended to retire on his own timeline after a successor search was underway and when he felt the institution was ready. Then suddenly, within 24 hours of the WilmerHale report being delivered to the board, he announced his retirement. Even in his letter Friday, Botstein seemed eager to frame the decision as one long in the making, tied to his upcoming 80th birthday and the completion of Bard's enormous $1 billion endowment campaign, which Botstein led. But the timing is impossible to ignore.
Exactly. So speaking of timing, let's go back a little bit. We've been reporting on the relationship between Botstein and Epstein for quite a while. What did the Daily Catch learn from examining the Epstein emails over the past 4 or 5 months?
Yeah, so it's actually been since January. And our reporting showed a number of key points. So first, that Botstein's relationship with Epstein was far more extensive than previously understood. Epstein's name appeared with Botstein's more than 2,500 times in the DOJ files, and the emails showed repeated contact over years. Fundraising appeals, campus visits, and the logistics to arrange them, concert invitations, and introductions to Botstein involving young women around Epstein. Secondly, we saw that Epstein used Botstein to provide favors to young musicians he was trying to recruit. And Walter, we did one especially extensive story about a violinist for whom Epstein sought favors involving Botstein. Epstein also requested that Botstein offer reviews of various women's musical ability, provide tickets to impress them to concerts at the American Symphony Orchestra, which is not affiliated with Bard, but which is very much affiliated with Botstein, and access to meet Botstein at dinners. And then there were more things. It went on and on. Third, and this is, I think, especially troubling, we did a very long story, Walter, in which we saw language from Botstein that often appeared deferential, even obsequious, some would say servile, towards Epstein. We also reported that Epstein visited Bard in 2013 by helicopter with several young female assistants, and that Botstein personally escorted them around the campus. Now, Botstein had previously told the New York Times that he was never around Epstein's assistants. And I put assistants in quotes because, as we know, these women were far more than assistants. And moreover, he had said that there was no contact with Bard's students. Many of these statements now are impossible to square with the truth as evidenced in the DOJ files and as confirmed by the very detailed WilmerHale investigation.
So then what changed between what Botstein previously said and what the WilmerHale investigation uncovered?
Several things, Walter. So Botstein had previously minimized the relationship. And according to WilmerHale, he was, quote unquote, not fully accurate in his public and internal statements. The review found that among his contacts with Epstein that stretched from 2012 to 2019, as we had also previously reported, Botstein visited Epstein's townhouse in the city 25 times. He did indeed make a 2-day visit to Little St. James, Epstein's private island, and he had repeated interactions with women who were later identified as Epstein's victims. Now, whether he knew that they were his victims is very hard to unpack and untangle. But one would expect that given what we all know now and what was possible to know at the time, given the 2008 sexual abuse conviction, that Botstein certainly could have known, surmised, expected, anticipated that he was around Epstein's victims.
So let's talk for a little bit more about Jeffrey Epstein's island. There's a lot of interest and speculation about the island, probably because it sounds so interesting and so privileged. What exactly did Botstein do when he visited Jeffrey Epstein's island?
Yeah, so let me just back up here and say that the question that has surrounded the island is, did Botstein actually make it to the island, right? We know, and there has been no refutation of this, that Botstein made plans to visit the island, but Botstein has said that he got too sick to actually make it to the island, that he got down there on a flight. He went down there with one of the young women around Epstein, along with Leon Black's family, Leon Black being a billionaire financier and art collector who did, in fact, make a donation to Bard. What we hear from WilmerHale, though, is that Botstein did make it to the island, that visit actually happened. So it's another case of like the truth being stretched or Botstein not remembering correctly and WilmerHale correcting the record there.
What about Epstein's female assistants?
Yeah, so in terms of discrepancies, this is one of the starkest. Botstein had told the New York Times in 2023 that he never witnessed young female assistants around Epstein. But the Daily Catch, when we reported on that 2013 visit by helicopter, reported that absolutely he was around the assistants. Not just one, but there were, I think we saw 3 assistants in the photographs that were released by the Department of Justice, and they're sitting in Botstein's private porch at Bard, right? So another example of something that's hard to square. And in addition, WilmerHale later found that Epstein came to Bard and concerts with women who have since been identified as victims.
So what listeners may not understand is that as part of the WilmerHale investigation, they sat down and interviewed Leon Botstein. And in the report, they said that Botstein told investigators, quote, "I would take money from Satan if it permitted me to do God's work." And let me just read that again because it's a very loaded statement. Again, this is a direct quote from Leon Botstein that he told the WilmerHale investigators, quote, "I would take money from Satan if it permitted me to do God's work," end quote. What do you think that statement reveals about how Botstein justified his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein?
Yeah, Walter. So I'm going to answer that, but I also want to call out something about the report. So WilmerHale apparently turned over an extensive report to the Bard board. And the Bard board chose to release a short 2.5-page summary to the media and to the Bard community. I think it's very telling that given that they did interview Botstein, this is one quote that they pulled out. There are no other quotes in the summary, but this one is called out. So to me, it's an extraordinary statement, Walter, because it crystallizes the whole problem. Botstein appears to have believed that Bard's mission was so important that it justified pursuing money from almost anyone. But WilmerHale's findings suggest that this was not simply a hard-nosed fundraising philosophy, it became a moral blind spot. Epstein was not an abstractly controversial donor. He was a convicted sex offender, later found to be a level 3 offender. And Botstein still pursued him without doing basic due diligence, even, we should note, Walter, when others around him were warning him. My suspicion is that Botstein used this rather Machiavellian statement as a kind of moral defense. The idea that if his ultimate purpose is noble enough, preserving liberal arts education, supporting underserved students, sustaining the arts, and so forth, then one can justify engaging with deeply compromised people in pursuit of that mission. In Botstein's mind, Walter, I suspect that Bard's work was not merely another college enterprise, but something almost sacred, something indispensable, particularly at a time when liberal arts institutions have been feeling under siege financially and politically. And, Walter, to be fair, there is a long tradition in higher education and philanthropy of institutions accepting money from morally complicated people. Right? Universities, museums, orchestras have always wrestled with whether important cultural work can or should be funded by fortunes tied to exploitation, corruption, environmental destruction, opioids, authoritarian governments, you name it. And I suspect that Botstein saw himself operating within that tradition, perhaps believing that the greater moral good of Bard outweighed the ugliness of the donor. But what WilmerHale ultimately argues, Walter, is that this reasoning failed because Epstein was not merely morally compromised in some abstract or historical sense. He was actively dangerous. And the relationship went beyond quietly accepting a donation. It evolved into years of personal interaction that, according to the report, risked legitimizing Epstein, exposing Bard's students to him, and helping restore or launder his standing among elite institutions. That is where the quote-unquote ends justify the means argument really begins to collapse.
I think you're exactly right, Emily. That really gets to the heart of the problem. What did the WilmerHale report reveal about the faculty warning to Botstein and enhanced education?
So enhanced education is not a type of education. It's a organization that seems to be a mini foundation within Epstein's larger foundation. And we know that he used this organization, Enhanced Education, from which to make payments to some of the young women and from which to make donations. So I don't think we actually learned anything new from that mention in the report in terms of like new additional donations that we didn't already know about, but we reveal that there was this other organization that we had not really detailed very much about. The Times has reported about their role, and so have some others, but not in great extent. Now, the faculty warning, we don't know much about either. We just know that a senior faculty member who had been working with Botstein on a proposal to Epstein warned Botstein, stay away. Bad idea. I hope that we may at some point find out who that was. It's a bit of a deep throat situation for us right now. We'd like to know who that person was. But for right now, what's important is that we know that Botstein was warned. He really can't claim that no one stepped up and suggested he take a second look.
Let's pull back the camera for just a minute and kind of talk about the time frame of this relationship between Botstein and Epstein. How many years did the relationship last?
Yeah, so it stretched, Walter, from 2012 to 2019, so for 7 years, all after Epstein's 2008 conviction, to which I alluded a minute ago. And the Daily Catch has previously reported this same date range as the meaningful period of contact.
And the relationship seemingly ended when Epstein was arrested again in 2019 and then eventually found dead in his jail cell.
Yes.
At what point does a fundraising relationship become something more problematic?
Well, as I was just discussing, it really becomes problematic when the fundraiser is not just accepting money, but helping launder the donor's reputation or granting access to students or campus life, assisting people in the donor's orbit, and then, and this is key, failing to fully inform the governing board. WilmerHale specifically warned that Botstein's actions could have legitimized Epstein, exposed Bard students to him, or helped facilitate his continued abuse of women. So the reason WilmerHale, I think, takes this so seriously is Botstein then, perhaps unwittingly, became an accomplice to some of what Epstein was doing.
Would we call this naivete on the part of Botstein?
WilmerHale seems to suggest naivete, but I think the report points to something more troubling, which was a willful disinterest in knowing more. Epstein had been convicted in 2008, and in 2011, as we've been discussing, was found to be a New York level 3 sex offender. I'll talk about that in just a second. But WilmerHale says that a quick internet search would have revealed what exactly that meant, namely a high risk of reoffense. Yet Botstein did not investigate and instead viewed Epstein as what he called an ordinary sex offender who could be presumed capable of rehabilitation. So let's also note these facts. A level 3 sex offender is subjected to broad public disclosure of that person's identity and whereabouts. In addition, inclusion in the public online sex offender registry and ongoing verification requirements with law enforcement. There is every way in the world for Botstein and his capable fundraising team to have known these details in 2012.
So just to connect the dots here for listeners, inviting a level 3 sex offender to visit your college campus or to visit your high school in New York City would be considered a bad decision.
Very poor judgment, right? And, I don't know Leon well, Walter. I am a donor to the Bard Tone Orchestra, but I see Leon Botstein around. I listen to him talk, and I can imagine that someone in his elite intellectual circles who perhaps lives in his head a great deal of the time could have sort of turned a blind eye. But what just keeps coming back from the WilmerHale report is, yes, but you were warned. So some kind of myopia took over here. And without talking to Botstein, it's very hard to know what actually happened and why. But we cannot ignore those facts.
So from the WilmerHale report, what did we learn about what Botstein told or did not tell the Board of Trustees?
Yeah, so WilmerHale found that Botstein did not discuss with the board whether Bard should accept donations from Epstein or whether Botstein could accept payments from an Epstein entity, nor that enhanced education funds came from Epstein. It also found that the 2014 Leon Black donation, which Botstein understood was made at Epstein's direction, was disclosed to the board only as money from Black. So again, what was going on in Botstein's mind, and why wasn't he more forthcoming? We don't know. Whether we will ultimately know, Walter, whether more of this report will come out and we will understand more of Botstein's thinking is a question.
So the end goal here was for Jeffrey Epstein to donate money to Bard. How significant were Epstein's contributions, and does that matter?
So Epstein did not end up making major contributions to Bard, which is important. But the size of the donations is not the only issue. So Bard received $75,000 in 2011 and $50,000 plus 66 laptops in 2012 for the Bard Early College program. And Botstein personally accepted fees under a consulting agreement with an Epstein entity, likely Enhanced Education, in 2016, which he says he later donated to Bard as a gift that seems to have been made in the name of him and his wife. The deeper question, though, is not simply how much money came in, but how much institutional judgment was compromised in pursuit of getting it.
So let's bring the story back up to the present. What changed the dynamics around Botstein's retirement and the announcement last
Yeah.
week?
Right. So, as we mentioned at the top of the podcast, before the WilmerHale report, Botstein had indicated that he would set his own retirement timeline and stay until a successor search was underway. And he had made those comments, Walter, even after the DOJ files were released. What changed was the independent review. It gave the board a documented basis to say that Botstein's judgment, transparency, and leadership had and have been seriously called into question. Even though Botstein's letter, the one shared on Friday with the Bard community, framed the decision as long planned, the timing is very hard to separate from the report and the urgency with which that letter came out.
Looking back, what is the responsibility of the Bard board in everything here?
I think experts would say that the Bard board has real responsibility here, even if it did not have all the facts. A president who has led an institution for, at that time, more than 40 years, nearly 40 years, accumulates enormous power and deference. And that makes rigorous oversight even more important, I think many would argue, not less. WilmerHale found that the board lacked full visibility into the Epstein-related financial ties. But the next question, Walter, is why governance structures allowed so much to remain so closely held, and why direction wasn't given on the kinds of donations that were acceptable, and even down to the specific people. And I'm going to take a break here for a minute to just talk a little bit about the Daily Catch. So we're, of course, not fundraising on anywhere near the level that Bard was. We're not looking for billion-dollar matching grant donations and so forth. But we take extreme care to share the names of every single donor we are going to recruit. And we talk about it, you and I, Walter, amongst ourselves. And when we think there may be a question, we go to our board and we lean on our board for advice and insight. And if we're not sure, or if somebody has warned me or you, we either rinse our hands of that potential donor relationship, or we think carefully about how we're going to navigate it. And I think all nonprofits governed by IRS rules and regulations should be required to follow those same standards.
So regardless of what has happened with this WilmerHale report and Botstein's decision to step down, you can't deny that he's had an extraordinary run as the president of Bard College. To lead that institution for more than 50 years and to build it into the extraordinary institution it is commendable. How should people weigh Botstein's legacy against this immediate controversy?
Yeah, so I think both things can be true. Botstein transformed Bard from a financially fragile small college into an institution of national and global prominence. And his impact on the Hudson Valley and on liberal arts education is enormous. But a great legacy, sadly, does not erase serious failures of judgment. The task now, Walter, I believe, is to hold both truths at once. The institution Botstein built, the tremendous pride that we as members of this community have in Bard, and yet the harm caused by the choices that Botstein made.
Let's talk a little bit more here about both things being true. Reader reaction to our coverage of Botstein has been very interesting. Some readers have commended our coverage, others have criticized our coverage. Can you talk just a bit, Emily, about how you balanced this story and how you approached it overall?
Yeah, it's been personally and emotionally for me very, very painful, actually, Walter, because I'm a donor to the Tone Orchestra. I have been for almost since its inception. It's 10 years old, or in its 11th year. I'm so grateful that I get to go to tone concerts, conservatory concerts. I know many people who go to Bard's Lifelong Learning Institute and are so happy for it. I used to swim at the Stevenson Pool. Bard is I walk my dog every morning at Bard. Bard is woven into the fabric of my life in many ways that I didn't even anticipate when I moved here, Walter, in 2016. Right? So it's been very difficult to put those feelings on a table and say, you're over here, feelings. My job right now is to the readers of the Daily Catch and to be ethically grounded in my journalistic responsibility. So I have tabled those feelings, as I said, and tried to follow and walk down the road and stay in my lane as a journalist. And I think we have portrayed the details we have found with great care. And it's been actually very comforting and rewarding over these last few days since I wrote an open letter about this to the community on Sunday ahead of our daily newsletter, our weekend review newsletter, to hear from readers who are grateful for the way we covered this story. And the hope, I should say, Walter, the way that we will continue to cover this story.
So speaking of continuing to cover the story, what happens next for Bard?
Yeah, so the board says that it will name an interim leader for the next school year and that it will launch a national search for Bard's next permanent president with broad stakeholder input. So the community should watch who is chosen as interim, how open the search process is, whether faculty, students, staff, alumni feel genuinely heard, and whether the next president marks a real governance reset or simply a continuation of the old structure.
What reforms might the Board of Trustees take up as a result of what's happened?
Yeah. So the board, Walter, has already said that Bard will strengthen its policies on donor vetting, fundraising, and conflicts of interest, with outside counsel reviewing existing procedures. The key will be whether those reforms are specific and enforceable. Clearer donor review rules, for example, mandatory disclosure of donor intermediaries, tighter conflict of interest policies, and stronger board oversight of presidential fundraising. And Walter, we don't know as media the degree to which we will have insight into all of these issues. We will have to see. I think it's also going to be interesting, Walter, for us to follow what actually does happen with Leon Botstein, right? So the board has announced that Botstein will move out of the president's mansion or home into what's called Finberg House. So he's going to leave, of course, the president's home as that becomes occupied by the next president. He's also stated that he will continue on as a faculty member, that he will continue to work on Bard's Summerscape, the big summer programming initiative, that he will continue to work with the conservatory. Absent from those disclosures has been what role he will have with the orchestra now, which I called Tone a minute ago. We don't know, but we will be watching closely to see what role Leon has in the classroom and out as he continues his relationship with the college.
An institution like Bard, or any college for that matter, has many constituents. What constituencies will the board be considering as it looks at having to do this reset, as you mentioned?
Yeah. Well, we'll see what they choose to consider. I would think, based on interviews I've done, that they'll have to consider students and faculty, staff, alumni, donors, parents, perhaps survivors of sexual harm, and the broader Hudson Valley community. Bard is not just a campus, Walter, as we've been discussing. It's a major local institution, a major employer. It's a cultural force. The board's challenge is to reassure all of those groups that Bard is not merely managing a public relations crisis, but is actually learning from what happened. I think it's a tremendous opportunity for Bard, actually, as it is for many institutions who go through this kind of reckoning. But we'll see where they end up.
So speaking of public relations crisis, will this have a lasting impact on Bard's reputation?
Far be it from me to say. It really depends on what the board does next. I don't believe that the controversy will erase Bard's academic and cultural stature, but it will become part of the institution's history. It will be part of the Wikipedia entries. It will be part of the legacy of the institution. If the board responds with transparency, reform, and a credible leadership transition, the damage may be contained and may be contained quickly. If it responds defensively or opaquely, the controversy could linger and shape how people view Bard's governance for many years to come. There's one other thing that I want to mention here that's really interesting. Bard's board is largely people who have been selected by Leon Botstein, and many of them are quite elderly. So that's another thing that I think will be interesting to watch. What happens to the constitution of Bard's board, and how does that change as this new president is found and introduced to the community and to the higher education community largely?
It's going to be interesting to watch. So speaking of watching, what can readers expect to read in the Daily Catch in the short term about the Botstein-Epstein story?
Yeah, so we'll be continuing to try to follow every single thing I've discussed on this podcast. I think perhaps our most urgent question, and the one I'm most interested in understanding, is the one to which I just alluded, which is what now for Botstein at Bard? I think that's very interesting, in part because of the public-facing roles that Leon Botstein has. He gets up and he conducts the tone orchestra. Is that going to continue? Is he going to be part of the admissions-facing piece? Is he going to do guest conducting on behalf of Bard at Carnegie Hall? So is he going to conduct at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where he conducts now? These are going to be very interesting things to watch. And does he sit in his back row seat at the Fisher Center and watch other concerts? So we're going to be watching that. We're going to be trying to find out as much as we can. Of course, we would love to see the more robust WilmerHale report, and we will be trying to get it. Whether we are successful, who knows?
Emily, it's always a pleasure to be back in the studio with you.
So much fun, Walter. So great.
This concludes today's episode of The Catch-Up. A big thank you to Maddie Rosenberg, Jen Hammoud, and Esther Martell at our partner Radio Free Rancliffe for their help in producing today's episode. We'll see you next time.